Hey folks, my name's Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and last week I asked you which beloved childhood character you'd like to see get a north of the border makeover, and... fine. Now, I don't actually know a whole lot about the Teletubbies since they were on BBC growing up, and my parents were concerned that TV would melt my brain, so we only had the public broadcast station. Joke's on them though, since I turned out to be a real piece of garbage without the corrupting influence of television. I am, however, thankful for my parents' fear of TV breaking my brain, since it meant that I didn't have to endure the utter horror of Teletubbies until I was an age that I could fully appreciate the insanity that is a giggling baby-faced son and four very colorful delinquents spying on kids' lives with their built-in television stomachs. Honestly, I'm not sure I can do anything to these characters to make them any more horrifying than they already are. But let's give it a try. First thing first, I'm gonna make the four faces of my four horsemen, since the faces are really the only part of them that have any detail whatsoever. The general shape of a Teletubby face is pretty straightforward, so once I've mushed a couple little balls into slightly wonky domes, I can start to poke the divots for some big ol' soul-stealing eyeballs, then cut a little gap for a completely toothless smile. The television fats don't seem to have any teeth, and I want to stick to the original design, so I'm not going to be giving them any teeth either. Well, not on their faces, at least. I'll then make the nose, which is a very simple, inoffensive affair, and I can start to smooth and blend the surface until I've got my final shape. Of course, I always thought that it looked like Poe and Lala were wearing someone else's face on top of theirs, so why not lean into that here? To make the literal face masks these two monsters will be wearing, I've rolled out the thinnest sheet of gray clay pasta I can with my pasta machine. I'll then cut out a couple little circles out of said sheet, then gently attach them around the eyes, leaving the edge ragged. I'll then poke some nose holes into the nose and add a larger hole around those for the nose on top. Then I can wrap the mouth in a big oval and give it the same treatment I gave the eyes. I'll then give the lips a little chapped texturing before wrapping the whole head in another thin strip of clay, blend it in on one side, then using my scooping tool, I can remove some sections of the mask, separating the loose skin from the soon-to-be stitched skin. A bit of knife work will add some rips and tears to the face mask, and I can fix a few of the more egregious tears with some simple stitching. Finally, to affix the mask to Lala's face, I'll add plenty of stitching around the edge where the skin's been pulled tight. Once that's done, I can safely remove Lala's face from the block of wood with my knife. Then I can repeat these steps to make Poe's face. It's pretty much the exact same process, but with some obvious changes to the stitching and a bit more Poe showing through the mask. Otherwise, that's half the Teletubbies done, so it's time to make Tinky Winky. I could easily just make all four tubs with the same face mask, and it would probably be more canonical, but that wouldn't make for a great video if I just kept repeating the same process. So for Tinky Winky, I figured I'd make him maskless and hoodless, which means I need to make the whole head at once. Once I've got myself a clay-wrapped ball of aluminium mounted on a block of wood, I can start to refine the shape in pretty much the exact same process as I did with the other two. However, since he won't be wearing someone else's face, I'll make sure to give him plenty of character and detail by adding wrinkles on wrinkles on wrinkles. I'm actually going to be using Gollum as a reference here, since I'm imagining Tinky Winky as being more hunched over on all fours rather than standing upright, almost like the rays of that baby-faced sun god are burning his demonic skin to the point that he can't comfortably stand upright. With my face looking pretty excellent, I can attach his oversized ears, then blend them in and give them some not quite right textures inside before jamming the Tinky Winky television antenna on top and covering it in a thin layer of clay. Now, I'm pretty sure that if the things sticking out of their heads were a part of the clothing, then they'd all have a uniform shape rather than being unique to each tubby, so I think it's safe to assume that they're actually additional appendages that are grown directly out of the tops of their heads. However, with Tinky Winky finished, I can place them with the other finished faces and get to work making Dipsy. Again, I wanted to try something different here, so I'm just gonna make Dipsy a skull. In my headcanon, the Teletubbies are a two-part cosmic horror. The face you see is actually only half the body, while the body itself is an entirely separate entity that has control over locomotion. In fact, my original idea was to give Tinky Winky a set of tiny spider legs and have its head completely removed from its body, instead standing on top of the torso, but somehow that felt too cursed even for me. By all means though, take a minute to imagine what that would look like. It would probably look like this. Back to Dipsy though, I figured Dipsy would exemplify the harsh realities of the Teletubby universe by implying that they died some time ago and the body has just carried on their demonic work without them. Otherwise, with a skull size and anatomy appropriate for a Teletubby head, I can remove it from the block, add it to the other 3, then throw all of them in the oven for a bake before getting to work making the bodies. The bodies will be mostly made out of aluminum foil that I've scrunched up until they look like shiny silver pitless avocados. These then get wrapped in a layer of clay and I can set them aside while I bulk up the back of the head with a similar foil and clay mixture until I've got a mostly appropriately sized Teletubby head. I'll then stick the head onto the body and wrap a long wormy dealie around the rim to create the lip of the hood before blending it all together. To give the uniform a bit of texture, I've scrunched up a little ball of aluminium that I can then press aggressively into the surface of the clay, which should impart a chaotically fluffy texture. Then it's time to get to work making the monster's mouth. As I said before, I'd like to think that there are 2 entities entwined to make a Teletubby, and the body section is kind of like Mike Wazowski, but instead of an eye, it's got a big, gaping, toothy mouth. Again, I could have made a television here with broken glass and something sinister on the screen, but I wanted to make a mouth, and I'm the captain of this sinking ship, so by God, I'm gonna make a bunch of stomach mouths. Although, now that I think about it, it probably would have looked really good if it was a television but the broken glass were teeth. That's such a good idea. I have so many regrets now. Is it too late to start over? It's too late to start over. We're just gonna stick with the mouths. I mean, the mouths still look great. It's just that they could have been TV mouths. Moving on, it's time to drill some little holes to fit some little wire so that I can then wrap in some more wire and attach big lumps of clay to make some little stumpy legs. There's not a whole lot to say about the legs, as they're pretty much just the floppy feet of a onesie, which means there's not a whole lot of detail to get hung up on. So once I've added as much detail as I can, I'll add a little bit more of that aluminium ball texture, then drill another hole in the top of the head so I can jam Lala's head finger into the top. However, rather than try and wrap it in clay, I'm just going to paint a thick glob of bacon bond over the wire, since it's a lot easier than trying to squish a teeny tiny bit of clay over such a flimsy mount. Otherwise, all that's left to do for his head is stick his ears in place and I can get started making his arms. These start out as little clay sausages that I'll split in 2, then poke and prod into kinda arm-like appendages with little mittens at the tips. These then get pressed into his shoulder, but before I blend them in, I want to make a little cleaver handle out of some bamboo skewers cut to size, which I'll finish up later. For now though, they'll give my hands a good pose, and I can start to blend the arm into the body and add the texture. The other arm I'll make in the exact same way, but instead of holding a handle, the left arm will be hand open, held to the side. Finally, I can add some final details like the rims around his ears and his top finger, which will help to show that it's a hood separate from the body, and that's Lala completely finished, which means I can get to work doing much the same to Poe. The only difference in the bodies is that I've tilted Poe's head slightly to the side because Poe is a mischievous little murder monster, and the mouth in Poe's midsection won't be open wide, tongue hanging out, but instead I've made a dismembered hand that I'll have hanging out of its mouth. After all, this is a waste not want not collaboration, so whatever leftover body parts Poe doesn't use for his outfit need to be recycled somehow. Then I can make his legs and ears and top appendage in the exact same way, as well as give Poe a left arm holding a little knife handle. The right arm, however, will be turned palm facing inwards so that I can line both Poe and Lala up in such a way that they're holding hands. That means we're halfway through the sculpting process and it's time to get work making my Gollum-inspired Tinky Winky. Tinky Winky's body is a slightly smooshed gray avocado that I'll stick some lengths of armature wire into and pose in such a way that I can have the limbs supporting the hunched over body. I'll then start to build up the clay along the limbs until I've got a couple bent knees as well as one fully extended arm with a palm facing the ground, kinda like Tinky Winky has landed in that Hollywood superhero pose, but instead of a left arm held out to the side, Tinky Winky's left arm will be curled in towards the face where it will eventually be holding a tasty little treat. Finally, I wanted to make it look like Tinky Winky just pulled its hood back, so I'll smoosh a bunch of semi-random blobs of clay into a somewhat hood-like pile of clay and roll my sculpting tool back and forth until it looks kinda like an unhooded hood. Otherwise, once the texture is in place, that's another Teletubby finished, which means the only one left to do is Dipsy. Dipsy, of course, isn't currently in a state of living, but all I've got so far is the front of the skull, so much like I did with the first two, I'll bulk out the back of the head to make my hood, then attach that to the body. However, I want to make sure the hood is a little looser, since Dipsy's face no longer has the bulk to press against the edge. With the head in place, I can blend the hood and body together, then clean up the area around the hood. The rest of the body gets the same treatment as the others, but I wanted to give Dipsy a bit of a zombie-like stance since, you know, that whole not really being alive thing anymore, so I'll turn one of the legs in at an awkward angle. Then I'll stick the straight top finger in place, but instead of the ears, I'll mark out a space, then drill out the holes where the ears should be since, much like the rest of the face, the ears have decayed over time, leaving nothing but skull underneath. Finally, to add that zombie-like look, I'll attach Dipsy's arms so that they're hanging straight down. With that though, all 4 Teletubbies are finished, so the only thing left to sculpt is a couple of little weapons for Po and Lala to hold. I've rolled out some thinnish blobs of clay that I'll then cut to shape, leaving me with a little cleaver and a little chef's knife. A bit of simple sanding will sharpen the edge, and I can glue the blades to the handles I made earlier and give them to the appropriate tubby. Also, I made a little skin-covered bone for Tinky Winky to gnaw on, but that is otherwise all the sculpting finished, which means it's finally time to add some color. I knew painting was going to be a ball ache and a half, but I thought maybe it would cut down on some of the worst of it if I were to use my airbrush to at least add the skin tones. I started with an ultra light, nearly white but tinted slightly pink flesh tone for the 3 faces before adding a darker wash for shading. Dipsy, on the other hand, gets a base coat of white, followed by a bone white wash that turned out to be way too dark, but I'll just fix that up later. While I've got the airbrush out, I'll also blast the belly mouths with a pink base coat as well, before moving on to painting all the main body colors by hand. This turned out to be kind of a stupid idea since painting yellow over gray ensures maximum ballage, but I couldn't be bothered masking off the already painted faces, and I never learned my lesson when it comes to paint. On the other hand, the red, purple, and greens of Po and Tinky Winky and Dipsy were pretty easy to apply and really only needed a single coat to get good enough. I then followed all the base coats with a heavy-handed dry brush of appropriately tinted lighter colors before going back to the masks to apply a gentle lightening of the skin with a sponge. At this point, I realized the outfits were a bit too flat, so I'll add a bit of shading around the hoods and any wrinkles with some darker glazes before going back to the skull and applying some dark red wash around all the exposed flesh. Then, before it's allowed to dry, I'll use a brush to rub it outwards to create a dark red gradient before once again using that same red to make just the edge look extra raw. Finally, I'll paint the stitches dirty brown and move on to lightening up the bone on Dipsy's skull by aggressively brushing a series of thinned out whites over the larger surface. I'll then add a bit of shading back into the cracks and mouth section, then it's on to painting each of the mouths with a series of reds and pinks, wet blending them together till they look appropriately gnarly, and I can paint all the teeth bone white with an umber wash. I'll then give all the eyes a white base coat followed by a set of nearly eyeball-sized irises in dark gray or brown with a matching set of pitch black pupils in the center. Finally, I'll coat the eyes in the ever-important UV resin to make sure they're extra shiny. Last but not least, I'll give the belly mouths a coating of high gloss varnish followed by a gooping up of Oohoo so they look nice and drooly. Oohoo is an extra tacky glue that dries clear and is nice and stringy, so it works great for adding a bit of saliva to an otherwise dry mouth. Finally, I'll give my blades a coating of chrome paint till they're nice and shiny, then I'll mix a little Oohoo with some dark red paint and coat the blades before sliding them into their appropriate hands. Otherwise, that's us done here and on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to the gems over on Patreon that support the creation of, well, these sorts of things despite their best intentions, and a big hey how are you to my newest patrons. Don B. Creates, Alex Urick, Sandwich, Paige, Sapphire, Eli Abenwees, Leland Lewis, Potion Master Charles, Mr. Timon, Ashley and Eric, Johnny T 2002, Grayskull's Dino Cat, John Watson, Benji, and I love being an adult with you, Hator. You are the carnivorous, self-contained body that the spider-legged head of a channel sits atop. Let me know which Teletubby is your favorite down below, and let me know what I should do next. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.